Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Extreme Heights is a scenario that is all about building a massive park with lots of intense roller coasters in order to get to the goal of 4,500 guests. But what if we just didn't? What if we don't build any rides or stalls and only use what we start out with? I got inspired to do this by this Reddit post, in which user CookieX792 beat Extreme Heights with only Flaming Fury and an absolute crap ton of stalls. They claimed it was impossible without all the extra stalls, but I'm not so sure about that. So, how do we get 4,500 guests with just one roller coaster and 2 stalls? We got 3,000 guests in Amity Airfield with just one ride, but almost all of those guests came from advertising, and that is something that we cannot do in Extreme Heights. It is one of the scenarios where you have no money, which is great because it allows you to build whatever crazy massive coasters you like, but it also means you have no access to ads. This means that guests will be spawning at a very slow rate, as our soft guest cap is only 150. Guests do still spawn if you have more guests than the soft guest cap, but only at a quarter of the normal rate. In most scenarios this would be a big problem, but Extreme Heights has no time limit, so we can do it as slowly as we like. In order to keep 4,500 guests occupied with just one ride, we're going to once again build a massive queue line, one large enough to hold at least 4,000 guests. Before we do that, it's a good idea to hire a lot of handymen and entertainers. To make Extreme Heights more difficult, the 4,500 guest goal is accompanied by the requirement to never let your park rating drop below 700, otherwise your park will be closed. The handymen and entertainers are there to make sure that the park stays clean and that the guests stay happy. Since there is no money in this scenario, we don't have to worry about all the paychecks and we can hire as many as we want. Now let's build the queue line. To keep the ride accessible during the construction of this massive queue line, we're going to first build it separately and connect it once we're done. I don't know how long it needs to be exactly to hold 4,000 guests, so I'm just going to overdo it and make it long enough to probably hold at least 6,000 guests. We already have entertainers to prevent the guests from leaving the queue line, but we might as well also add TVs, as money isn't an issue. With the one mechanic locked up on the path next to the exit to fix the ride in case it breaks down, we're now ready to start waiting. And so we wait. After 1 year we have 462 guests, which is just over 10% of the goal. Considering we already had about 170 guests when we started the scenario, it's clear that it's going to take a very long time. By the end of year 2 we have about 770 guests, which is progress, but there is a potential problem. Any guests that arrive at the entrance building of Flaming Fury get processed by it almost immediately. As a result, a proper queue hasn't started forming yet. I'm afraid that the throughput of the ride is too high and that we won't be able to build up a long queue line to keep the guests in the park. I would prefer to do this challenge without altering the ride to lower the throughput though, so I'm going to wait a little longer to see what happens. Another year later, still no real queue has formed, but we do have more than 1,000 guests now, so we're still making progress. Even though there is no proper queue, there are lots of groups of guests all over the queue line, so there are deceivingly many guests in it. Out of the roughly 1,080 guests in the park, there are currently more than 500 in the queue line. I'm still not sure that the current settings will get us to 4,500, but I'm going to keep going until it fails. Halfway year 5 we finally get a real queue at the entrance building of the ride. It has taken a while, but it finally seems like the current settings will get us to the goal. In April year 6 this line has mostly disappeared, but more guests are coming. Guests clump up into groups on long queue lines and currently there is a massive group approaching. The reason that this happens is that guests can't overtake each other in a queue. The guest at the front of the group is always some lazy bastard who can't be bothered to walk faster than the love child of a snail and a sloth. When we fast forward, we can see the queue slowly growing longer and longer as the guest count rises. As we know from my previous video, the guest generation is the same whether we have 500 guests in this park or 5,000, so new guests will keep spawning. With the guest happiness not changing when they're in the queue line, the park rating is high and stable, so we really do have all the time in the world. In year 10 we're nearing 3,000 guests. If we check the park statistics, we can see that the coaster is doing a really good job at keeping the guests in the park. Out of the 3,750 guests that have entered the park, about 75% are still in it. And this is not because the guests are stuck forever in the queue line. Flaming Fury has had more than 20,000 customers, meaning that on average every guest has ridden it more than 5 times. They just like it so much that they're immediately going back into the line. In my Amity Airfield with one ride challenge, I emphasized lowering the throughput as much as possible, but this challenge shows that that might not be necessary at all. We still need quite a lot more guests, so let's hit the fast forward button again. As the years go by, the park is becoming a teenager and is starting to hit puberty. I don't think I've ever taken this long to beat a scenario before. In year 15 we hit 4,000 guests, meaning we're almost there. It's quite clear now that the queue line is much longer than necessary, as the line hasn't even reached the end of the first part yet. In July year 17 we're nearly there with about 4,490 guests, only 10 more to go. On the 11th we finally reach 4,500 guests, but we don't pass the goal. Right before the end of the day a guest leaves and puts us at 4,499 again. On the 12th the same thing happens again. We reach 4,500 guests, but before the game checks if we've beaten the scenario at the end of the day, we lose a guest again. I don't know which guest tortured us by leaving the park at just the wrong time, but I hope that they burn in hell. 2 days later, on the 14th of July, we once again reach 4,500 guests, and this time it's for real and we beat the scenario. We managed to get 4,500 guests in extreme height without building any rides or stalls. All we did was hire a lot of staff and build a queue line that is slightly longer than usual. I would like to give a shout out to our mechanic who has fixed Flaming Fury 76 times over the 16.5 years it took us to beat the scenario. Even though the ride has 0% reliability left, it only has a downtime of 4%. I'm so glad that the staff members don't mind working 24/7 without any breaks or even a salary. Money doesn't exist in this world, so it's really unexpected that we are still able to find good people to do the job. You would expect us to need to use slaves or something for this, but I assure you that everyone who works here does so out of the goodness of their heart. In fact, it's the goodness they have for their family, who might not survive if they don't do exactly as I say. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video.